Hi, guys. Okay, we're going to carry on with exceptions and we're going to look at the try catch block, in detail to see what it does. Okay, so let's get to it. And yeah, hey, what's happening over here? What's my mouse doing on my screen? Sorry about this, guys. Oh, here's my cat. Fix, come here quickly. Come, go get that mouse for me, please. Yeah, I'll just get my cat to get that mat to catch the mouse quickly so we can carry on with our lessons. Yeah, I'm sorry about this, guys. Yeah, it's actually quite embarrassing. Oh, thanks, Figs. At last, I've got my mouse back. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so let's carry on here. Yeah, to explain the simple try-catch, what I've done is I've got a little class here with a main method, and it's calling test. And this test is it's got a flip image method, which is a static method over here. And by the way, these are all static, meaning that it doesn't need create an instance of a class. Okay, so this flip image here calls this method, and this method declares that it's going to throw input-output exception. That means it's a checked exception. If you recall the previous lessons, if you saw them, and that means that whatever method, when you call this method, the caller must either handle it or place it in a try catch, which I've just done over here. Okay, so I'm catching the input-output exception, and it's printing out that exceptions. It's got a method called getMessage, and it's going to display the message of this exception and the message that I've attached to it over here in the IO exceptions constructor. So let's run this and see what happens. Oh, and there it is. It printed out image unavailable as I've got it there. So it's working fine. Okay, so now I've added another test message. I've commented out the first one, so I'm calling the second one, and it's calling the static test. And I've got to try the same flip image, which would call that, and then you'd have to put it in a try catch as is. But I've got a problem here. You see, I'm getting errors. Okay, the issue here is, if you look at the previous one, they are in code blocks. The try is in a code block and the catch is in a code block. So one of the rules of the try catch is that it must be in a code block. Okay, so that would throw a compiler error. Okay, so the try and catch must be in braces. So even if I did this, that removes that error, but I've still got an error here. If I do that, my errors are gone, and if I go and remove this one and this one, then I've got a problem again. Okay, so they must be in a code block. Okay, so yeah, on test 3, I've got a try in a code block, but I'm still getting an error here. Okay, the issue here is that a try statement must terminate at least with a catch or a finally. You can have both. You can have a try by itself, or a try followed by finally, or just a finally, but you cannot just have a try without a catch or finally. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm just going to add some code here quickly. Okay, and I'm just going to uncomment that, and that looks like our first example, and you'll see I've got a try and it's in braces. That's fine, and I've got a catch. That is fine. Okay, and I can even add a finally to it, and that will be fine as well. So if I had to run this one, it is called test 3. So I'm just going to run it quickly, see what the output is, and let's just clear this output here. Okay, and run it, saves it, and runs it, and you see it. If I go to it over here, I called flip image. Flip image calls this message that throws an IO exception with a message in it saying image unavailable. And I'm actually calling the message here so that it catches that exception from it, and it comes here and it prints image unavailable, and then the finally is called. Now, what's important about the finally is that even if it gets run irrespective of what happens here, if an exception is thrown or not, it would still call finally. To show you that, let's just uncomment this one. So when I call this message, nothing happens here. It just returns back to the caller. Let's see. Then technically this exception shouldn't be caught because there's no exception coming back. Let's see what happens to the finally. And if I run it, you see the finally still gets called. Okay, so what I'm saying here is you have to have a catch and you can have a finally. What happens, and I showed you already the catch, what happens if you just got a finally and you don't have a catch? Let's see. Okay, now I've got a problem here because flip image is saying it needs an exception. It's catching exception, which is not happening here. It's throwing an exception, it's not being handled. So, and I said, but it's fine, the try is fine. Yeah, the try is fine, because if I did that, so I'm not calling anything, so the try could have something like system.out.println hello. Okay, so that doesn't throw an exception. It's just printing out a hello onto the screen. What's going to happen? The try, it's totally legal now. You see, it doesn't need a catch anymore because nothing is throwing an exception. But the try still needs either that or that. Okay, so what's going to happen in this case is if I run it, it says hello, so it prints out this line, and then it finally gets called. Okay, so a try-catch block needs a catch, finally, or both, or one or the other, depending on if there is an exception thrown here. Then you'd have to catch it there. Otherwise, it's going to tell you there's a problem. There's another way of handling this. Let's say I uncomment this one. Now I've got this error message here, which is because on my flip image, although I'm not throwing an exception here, because I uncommented, it's still saying that this message could throw an exception. This method could throw an exception. So you have to handle it or declare. Now the declare is the other one. So if I had to say I declare it over here, so I would say yeah that it will throw, say, exception, or let's keep it to IO exception since I'm using, but you could use the super class. Declares that it throws an exception, and suddenly that is fine. But now look here, now what's happening here is try is calling flip image, which declares to throw an exception. Okay, so I can actually take this highlight away now, uncomment away, and if I go back here, it's fine, because the try, although it's not catching it here, because it's not catching it here, I'm declaring to throw it again. But now what happens here? If I go to my test method, it's telling me that this exception has been propagated all the way to the main method, back to the main method, and it's telling me unhandled exception. So I have to put it in a try block here, or also declare it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to declare it here. I'm going to say throws, and this time I'm just going to use the superclass exception, and there's it. It will go all the way. And what would the output be in this case? Because let's think of it. Think about this, eh? So I'm calling test3. I'm coming over here to the static void test3. I'm in a try block here. I call flip image. Flip image throws an IO exception, which is declared to be thrown here. So image unavailable message comes here, and then it catches it. Will this hello be printed? That's the first question. Will I am finally be printed? What is it? Let's see what happens here. So if I run it, okay. So I am finally, yeah, gets printed. Okay. So what happens here is, if you follow it now, a call test comes here, it flips the image method. It calls the image message actually. Now the image message throws an exception. Now as soon as exception is thrown, the next line, no longer, let's say the program doesn't come to the next line anymore, but yet, even though it doesn't reach this line, finally still gets called. As you can see, I am here, I am finally here, gets printed out, and then the IO exception propagates all the way back, because I'm declaring to throw an exception here all the way back to the caller, which is this one, and because I'm not handling it here as well, I could have had a try catcher to catch it. It's now also declaring to throw it, and it throws it all the way to the Java virtual machine, and it stops the program over there. Okay, so you can see there is my image unavailable message still there. Okay, so yeah, so what are we actually saying here? Okay, what we're actually saying here is that try must have at least a catch or a finally or both or just one of them, but one of them must be there. Okay, so let's go to the next one now and see what we're going to do next. Okay, I've got another example of a try, and I've got a finally here. Okay, take note that I'm not actually throwing exception, I'm just printing hello, so I wouldn't have to have a catcher. But what if I had to now uncomment this line here? I've suddenly got a compile error here. So it is important that it's a try catch finally. You cannot have a try finally catch. You can have a try finally or a try catch, but you cannot have a try finally catch. Finally is your last one. Okay, so let's just put it in there. Okay, so that's another rule you should look at. Okay, this example, test 5. I've got a try here to print hello, followed by another try that says, how are you today, Mr. Exception? And then I've got a finally. Okay, this order is wrong here. Let me just delete that. I don't want that. Okay, so why doesn't this compile? I've got a finally at the end here. Okay, each try must be try finally or try catch or try catch finally, and not try finally or this try hasn't got the finally, so it won't work. Okay. Now you can use nested try catches, which I'm going to show you next. Okay, so here I've got an example of 2 tries catches in a nested format. So I've got an outer try. You'll see that one there. And it's got its own catch. I could have had a finally or catch, doesn't matter. I just use the catch here. And I use the catch here. Why? Because I'm calling flip image. And if you recall, flip image throws an exception here. So I have to, even if I had a finally here, I'd still have to have a catch in that case. Okay. Over here, inside it, I've got another try with its own catch. I could also have had a finally here. Okay, so I've got a try and it says oops. Okay, but now because it's an arithmetic exception, it's remember a runtime exception, you don't have to catch it. So it doesn't throw me an error that there's nothing there. So, but I'm going to go and say int I is equal to I divided by 0, and hopefully if everything goes well, okay, I first have to say the value of I. Let's make I 20, so you initialize it. Okay, and then I'm going to say I divided by 0. Okay. And I have to return a value, so let's say int result is equal to I divided by 0. And I could even go and say system.out.println result is plus result. Okay, so I just fixed that spelling mistake over here. I didn't like it, but anyway, so I ran it here, but let's just run it again and see what happens. To explain to you what's going to happen here, I'm coming into the first try block, and then the second try block. I am initializing the I to 20. Then I'm saying the result, which is int value, is I divided by 0. And now if you know an integer value, when you divide it by 0, it throws a runtime, specifically a arithmetic exception, which I'm catching here. You don't have to, but I want to catch it. Okay, to see what happens, I put it in a try block, because I could actually have taken that and that away. Let's just do it quickly. I could have done that and that and that, and you'll see it's still not complaining. It's because this is a runtime exception, if you guys recall. Okay, let's run it and see what happens. And you can see it says, oops, division divided by 0, image unavailable. So what's happening here, it comes into your second try block, it does this, and as soon as it reaches here, you'll see this result is not printed, because this one here threw a runtime exception. And because I'm catching the runtime exception, I do something with it. I print out, oops, division by 0, and then my program carries on. It comes to flip image, which throws an IO exception, and this message, which is called from over here, this one that's thrown, it's got a message in that exception, and because I'm using exceptions, get message, it prints out image available. So in the other case, you can have nested try catch finally blocks, and you could have another nest. Hi guys, I've just come from the future. It's quite cool, eh? Okay, what I just want to add on to what I was explaining is, if you look at this again, an arithmetic exception is thrown here, which is caught here. But remember, an arithmetic exception need not be caught. So if I uncomment this I comment out this try catch block over here like this, what's going to happen, because it's a runtime exception, this exception need not be caught here. Now my question is, it's these lines here, this exception thrown here, is it now caught over here? And what I'm trying to say here is, don't forget in what hierarchy the exception belongs when catching it. Now I've got a little sketch here to have a look. And if you can see here, this IO exception extends exception. So if you had to draw it, it inherits from exception. But the arithmetic exception first extends its superclass, which is the runtime exception, followed by the exception, as you can see here. Now, this makes a big difference. In the fact is, one of the facts is, as you recall, you don't have to, but you can if you want, catch or handle or catch or declare a runtime exception. While those that extend exception and throwable, you have to catch or handle it. You have to, otherwise a compiler gives you an error. Now, if we go back to this, as you can see, a runtime exception is thrown here. So this IO exception is never thrown. Is it caught here or not? So let's just run this and see what happens. And you can see that the message is not thrown here because it used to throw just a simple message. And what's happening here, you'll see here, down here, Java main, a Java lang arithmetic exception is thrown, and it tells me divided by 0. And this was thrown by 151, which is this line over here. Is correct, line 151. And then it propagates, so it goes from line 151, it goes to 259. So it doesn't come through here. You see, it goes to 259, not 159. So where is 259? If I go to 259, it's down here, down here. It's where test was called. Okay. And as it was where test was called, we got an IO exception declared here, but you wouldn't even need to, since this is a runtime exception. The Java virtual machine doesn't have to be in a try catch. So yeah, let me just delete this to see if it throws an error. No error is thrown, as you can see over here. Let me run it again just to see. And the same thing. So the Java virtual machine will catch it, and that's that. So if I go back to line 6, here it is, and there. And because it's a runtime exception, it wouldn't have to be caught. But what's important here again is a class hierarchy. Depending when you're catching exception, don't forget what class hierarchy it belongs to. The more specific exception would be caught in this case. Okay. Okay. Here I've got another example. What do you think the output will be for this one? Okay. If you guys recall, I always said that the catch may or may not run. In this case, it would run because I'm calling flip image, which, if you guys recall, it throws an IO exception, which is caught here. So it would print this. And if you recall in the previous example earlier on, I said that irrespective if a catch is caught or if no catch is thrown, the finally always gets called. Okay. So in this case, what do you think the output would be? Am I going to get a message like image unavailable followed by I'm finally here? Let's see what happens. Nothing happened. That's funny. Okay. Here's a rule to the finally not being printed. And that is that if a system exit is called, then the finally doesn't get printed. That is an exception. Okay. So what happens here it came here, but I exited. I told it system.exit, which actually tells the system, if you look at the terminal, is current running Java virtual machine. And when that gets done, when that gets called, the finally doesn't get called. Okay, now that's basically the only time the finally doesn't get called. Okay, yeah, I've got another example. What do you guys think the output will be of this little test? Test 8. What's happening here is I'm calling the test 8 here, and I'm printing its returned value. If you can see over here, I'm returning a string. So I'm returning this string. So what I'm doing is I'm initializing the string with a reference as s to an empty value. Then it goes through the try-catch block with a finally, and I'm saying I'm concatenating. In other words, I'm adding to that string every time. So I'm adding an f, then I'm calling the flip image here, which throws an IO exception. This is a caught exception, which is fine because I'm catching an exception here. It's superclass. So is it coming here? From here, is it going there? And what's happening here? Does this actually happen? Okay, let's see what happens. Yeah, Prince Figo. So, and that's, by the way, my cat that you saw in the beginning, his name. So what happens is if you come here, S is initially empty string. Comes into a try, it adds the F to it. So the string here, it creates a new string every time because a string is immutable, if you guys recall. If I haven't touched on this, believe me, it's immutable, meaning that every time a new string is created, and this time it's created a string with F. And since it was empty, that's all it's got. Okay, then it calls the flip image, which throws an exception. Let's go there. It throws an exception here. See, it throws. I'm actually throwing it programmatically. So it comes, it throws it, it gets caught here. And then S, and this plus equal is the same as concatenate. So it adds to the F and I. Finally is always called unless I had a system.exit over here. Okay, so now the string comes here, it creates a new string with fi and attaches g to it. When the finally is done, which we haven't handled yet, it will still come here because of the exception, everything was handled. It flows down to this one, and before I'm returning the s, I'm adding an o to it. And so when I print the result here, which comes back to the caller, it tells me Figo. Okay, another interesting thing here is no exception is thrown here, but yet it doesn't give me an error. An exception is a caught exception. Why is that so? Let's see what happened if I would say an IO exception there. Okay, so that's an interesting one which we'll discuss next. So let's see what happens in that case. So what I've got here is test 9, and you see I've got a try with a catch with an IO exception here. It's giving me an error. Okay, yet if I take this out, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to uncomment it instead of instead of taking it out. I did something wrong now. What did I want to do here? Okay, so you got an error here. Okay, but if I change this, first of all, to an exception. Now, exception is a super case of all caught exceptions. So that's the only case where you're allowed a caught exception without actually throwing an exception. Okay, so if you got a exception thrown here, that if you declare that you're going to catch an exception, Let's just put your input out of exception. And you don't throw an exception, it's going to give you an error. Okay. Except in a case where it's an exception over here, or if it was a runtime exception. Okay, this is a caught exception, but it's a runtime exception would act in the same way, no problem. But as soon as it's a caught exception, which is a subclass of exception, except for exception itself, then it's going to throw an error. Okay, the other issue here is I've uncommented, commented out the lines, and now if I say throws IO exception, I've got no problem. You see that? It doesn't give me an error, even though there's no exception thrown in the code here. So you're allowed to have a method that's got nothing in here. So we delete this. And you declare that this method is going to throw an exception. So you're allowed to do that in the future. You might be designing a method that you got no code for it, but it's going to read files or something. You're allowed to declare that it's going to throw any form of exception, including an exception, runtime exception, and so on. What you're not allowed to do is, you're not allowed to, like explained just now, you're not allowed to, that's the wrong thing, let me just undo what I did. What you're not allowed to do is that. Say that you're going to catch exception that is not a runtime exception or an exception itself, without it actually having code that would possibly throw an exception. Okay, so that's another one. Okay, so what I'm saying there is that the try-catch must throw a caught exception in here if the catch is, I'm just going to put here, if the catch is a caught exception, except if this was an exception or a runtime exception. Okay, let's look at this example now. Okay, hi, this is, I just come from the future again. So I've just added this little hierarchical diagram so that you can see the class hierarchy of my custom exceptions. So just keep this in mind in the following explanation, and thank you. So I've got a try here, but before we go to this, I've got my own custom exceptions here. So, and you can do that. You can create your own exceptions from an existing exception. So I've got a class car exception, extends runtime exception. Now remember, runtime exception is an exception that you don't have to catch, but I'm catching it in my example here. And then I've got my brake light exception, which extends my car exception. So runtime exception is the superclass of car extension, and car extension is the superclass of runtime exception. So if you had to draw it out here, you'd have something like runtime exception, car exception, brake light exception, and recall that runtime exception its superclass is exception, and so on. So see what's happening here. I've got a try catch block here, and I'm catching multiple exceptions here, which is allowed, by the way. You can catch more than one exception. So I've got a try here because I've got nothing there, but it's because I'm catching exception or runtime exceptions. I don't need anything here. Okay, remember the other rule that we mentioned earlier on. Okay, but now I'm catching a super type exception. Then I'm catching the car exception, which is the subtype of that one, and then I'm trying to catch a brake exception with subtype of that one. That's not allowed, because think of it, if exception is caught by the superclass, then the subclasses won't occur anymore because it's already been caught. Okay, so what it's saying here is the code is unreachable. Okay, so to do this, you have to go from subclass to subclass to subclass. So I'm just going to comment this out. What you'd have to do is something like this. Okay, just a typo, I fixed it. It's break light exception, and I had break exception. You call break light exception extends car exception, and car exception extends runtime exception. Now, this will work. I could have a runtime exception, so because I'm going from subtype to its, so that is that subtype, then the higher one, then its superclass. I could even add a runtime exception, and then I could catch its superclass, which is exception, and that would be fine. As you can see, there's no errors. So the subtype must be caught before the supertype. Okay, let's look at this example. What I've got here is I've got a try, and in this try I'm catching a null, I'm throwing a null point exception, which is a runtime exception. Then I'm catching this null point exception, and inside this null point exception, I've got another try catch block. And I'm throwing a new exception, an illegal argument exception, which is also a runtime exception. And I'm catching this illegal argument exception here. And now I'm throwing my custom new break light exception, which remember here, which extends car exception, which is also a runtime exception. So what exception is eventually going to be thrown to output? Is it a null point exception, a legal argument exception, or a break light exception? Okay, so let's see what this does. If I look at this, on line 23, the break light exception is thrown. Line 23, so it goes all the way from here. This one gets caught here, but I'm trying to throw a new exception inside this exception block. And this illegal exception is caught here, and then I'm throwing a new exception inside this catch block, which is the break light exception. So that's how it went. But what happens if I had to add a finally block? Okay, so interesting one. What would happen? Is it still going to be break light, or is it going to be something else? Now let's try that one. And the output now is car exception, which is this one that I threw here. Now, this is an important rule. If you got a try catch and finally, and your catch and your finally throws an exception, doesn't matter what happens inside there. If they both throw an exception, then the one that's thrown is your finally block. Okay, so don't forget that. Okay, so I've got another example, and I think I'm going to wrap it here after this example because it's become long. Okay, I've got a try here that throws an IO exception, which remember IO exception is an input-output exception, which is a caught exception. So it catches it here, which I would have to catch or declare it. Since I didn't declare it, I catch it here. And in this catch, I'm allowed to have another try block, which we handled before. And I'm actually throwing a runtime exception. I should have just put it there like that. And then this runtime exception is being caught by its catch, which is a superclass exception. And I'm printing it out. But if you've noticed here, I'm just going to save this. I've actually got an error here. This E here, this reference here is saying it's a duplicate parameter. So you must watch out for that because it's in the same scope as this one. So if I go and see this one here is that one scope, that's that one scope. You see, so this catch here, everything inside it it refers to that variable, and I'm trying to use that same variable there. So there I would have to use something else, an EX or something like that, and that would be fine. And if you had to run it now, so I didn't try it, but let's just go and run it. I'm just going to say test. I'll just change. Okay, let's do it like I always do. Instead of changing it, let's say test 12. And now if I call it, let's see what happens. Just going to save it, compile. Okay, so if I go all the way to where it is, which is throwing an input-out exception here, being caught there, and there I'm throwing a runtime exception, and it's printing eGet message. Now it's printing null, and that's because I've got no, in the runtime, I've actually thrown no, I've put no message in there. So the runtime, if you go and look at its constructor, you can have just one with no parameter or with a parameter in. So if I had to change it, say to hello, which you wouldn't say hello, but I'm going to say hello, and if I had to run it again, there wouldn't be null anymore. Hopefully, something has gone wrong here. Where am I throwing it? Just hold on. Okay, this was a tricky one because you see, remember I'm talking about scope here. Now what I'm actually saying here, I'm actually printing that one E, that E there. You see? So I'm catching an exception. I'm not throwing a new one, but I'm saying print E's message there. So technically, if I did this, and I'd say this one EX, I should then get a null followed by hello. And that's it. Okay. So guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this and learned something from it. And I'll see you guys next time, eh? Okay, so enjoy and do all those lovely things like pressing for subscribe and so on, you know. Okay, enjoy your day.